It's Song Talk Radio.
Welcome to Song Talk Radio, the show with songwriters talking to other songwriters about the craft of songwriting. We share tips, tools, and techniques, and together we all become better at writing songs. I'm your host, Neil Modi, and with me, my co-host, Phil Emery. How you doing, Phil?
Presently accounted for, and I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Make sure you check with your accountant on that.
Okay.
And please send your comments and questions to @SongTalkRadio on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or feedback at songtalk.ca, and we'll share your thoughts on the show. And please visit songtalk.ca to see the show post for this episode, to find links to resources we mentioned. You're going to be wanting to do that today, and to download lyric and chord sheets to follow along with the songs that we feature. Tonight, we are happy to be launching our 2023 Song Talk Songwriting Challenge, which is to write a song in an unusual mode. Yay! First off, we'd like to explore a little bit about modes, and helping us out today is Mr. Jeff Alan Greenway. Just a little intro. Jeff Alan Greenway is a film composer, singer-songwriter, and pianist from Toronto, Canada. Jeff has created music for a wide range of Canadian international film projects, such as the New Zealand horror film The Anniversary, the American short film The Window Seat, which explores the effects of Alzheimer's disease, and the Indian feature-length documentary The Secret Life of Frogs, which won a Nature Documentary Award at the Cannes TV and Media Awards. Welcome back to Song Talk Radio, Jeff.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Awesome
to have you back. It's been a while since we've seen you on the show. Like I said, we're exploring our songwriting challenge playing around with modes. And Phil just told us that he had a bit of a revelation about his exploring with modes. So let us know what that is, Phil.
Yes. So one of the things that always confused me about modes, like many guitarists, I'm self-taught. And as a self-taught musician, you have little islands of knowledge. You have very advanced stuff and you have basic stuff. And you learn what you need to do your stuff, but you have little gaps. And you learn to work around your gaps because you need to get stuff done. So I always understood the concept of modes, but I never quite understood it in a way that made a lot of sense. But I sort of figured going through this process, it's kind of made sense to me. So I'm going to share that with the folks. So I'm going to use my guitar here. I'm make sure. All right, so a mode is made up of basically a major scale, but instead of starting on the root, we start on one of the other notes in the of that major scale. Mm-hmm. So in the old days, everything was just in C. So to get some more variety, they would have their C major scale, but then they would start a scale maybe on the D or on the second step of the scale from D to D. And the relationship between those notes gives everything a slightly different sound. So if I'm going to play the G major scale. So that's the G major scale. Now, one of the things I got confused at, people would say, oh, this is in A Aeolian or D Dorian or something. And I could never quite figure that out because I knew it was based on a major scale. So all you have to do is really just remember the names of the different modes and the fact that they start on a different scale. So we're going to be doing two modes today, Dorian and Lydian. And the Dorian starts on the second step of a major scale, but it uses all the notes of that major scale. It just starts on number 2. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to use a Dorian mode, which is started on the second step of a major scale, so in G, that would be A. So when you talk about a mode, you would use the root note, which is A. So it's still in A, but it's actually using all the notes from the G major scale just in a different order, starting on the second one. So that instead of, it would be, so it's the exact same notes as the G major scale, but just in a different order. So when someone says A Dorian, it would be this. But I could also do it in C Dorian, which is using the C as the root. But the scale I would be basing it would be with the A sharp major scale, which would be, but using all the exact same notes as the as the A sharp major scale. Using a C Dorian would be, sorry. So again, you use the root note that you're wanting to work with, and this might be in this case C, but then you have to think about, okay, a Dorian, and you just have to know what the names mean. So you go, okay, a Dorian scale, a Dorian mode is based on the second step of a major scale. So what note, what scale would have C as the second note of the major scale? In this case, it would be A sharp. So listen to that a few times, pick up your guitar and play around with it, and then you'll kind of go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Because it was always that A Dorian or A Lydian that always kind of confused me, because I'm just going, well, what does that mean? So it is, you're still using a root note. It's just the order of the notes is different. And that's my contribution. And good night, everyone.
That's absolutely a fine way to look at it, for sure. Yeah, and actually there are, I think that's one way to look at it. And as most things with music theory, often there are more than one way to look at the same thing, which is literally the same thing from a sonic, note perspective. But the other way to look at it is, I actually posted a YouTube video on our Song Talk radio channel a while ago. I was playing around in Mixolydian, and the thing I discovered in that process was how everything does relate to the major scale. So is Dorian the same as a major scale, but it's got a flat 3 and a flat 7, and and then your root note is actually the same, but then you think about the different qualities of degrees of that scale, and I think that way to me is more interesting to look at things, because you begin to hear and discover which modes sound brighter and which modes sound darker. And that really can inform, a songwriting decision as to, I want this tone to be a little bit darker, a little bit brighter. When it comes to your writing process, Jeff, how do you prefer to look at modes?
Yeah, I've kind of looked at them both ways. I sort of come from a jazz background, so there's like a really, really heavy emphasis on modes because they're used a lot in soloing and that sort of thing. For me, I find the fastest way is the way that you mentioned, Neil, which is relating it back to a major scale that starts on the first note that you want to start on, right? So for instance, for Dorian, it would be thinking of, if I'm doing it in C, I would be thinking of a C major scale, but then lowering the 3rd and lowering the 7th, right? I sort of have all that memorized.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, kind of backwards to the way I would do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but both ways are equally
both ways are equally valid, and certainly that's the first way I learned it, because being a piano player, I was told just use the white keys and just start on a different note, and then you get the different modes, and that's perfectly, that works perfectly well. And especially being a piano player, you just stick with the white keys. That's always easier.
Yeah, or all the black keys.
Or all the black keys. There's only 5 of those. You don't have a 7-note scale if you stick
as Stephen Sondheim told us.
Yes. To do an episode with him one of these days. Okay, so like we said, today we're going to be exploring 2 specific modes, Dorian and Lydian, and we want to start with Dorian. So like you were just saying, Jeff, a Dorian scale, a Dorian mode is the same as a major scale, and of course, scale and mode are they equivalent, Jeff, or they are just sort of interchangeable in a casual language, or is there something specific about scale versus mode?
Well, I mean, yeah, scales, generally speaking, are just, a succession of notes from like root to root, basically. And there's millions of different scales out there, many of which aren't modes, right? They're alterations to modes, or they're alterations to major or minor scales. So mode, when we talk about modes specifically, we're talking about, like you guys both mentioned, the different degrees from the major scale starting on different notes, right? So, when we have alterations to those as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But the basic modes, as I'm sure everybody knows, I think you're going to put up a chart on this, right? Are Ionian, which is major. Actually, maybe I can just do a quick little demonstration. So major would be, right, so there's C major, and if I go up 1, I've got Dorian. I go up again, I've got Phrygian. And then we've got Lydian. Mixolydian, Aeolian, or also called natural minor, and the one that's very, very rarely ever used, which is Locrian. And they all have very, very different sounds, as you can hear. And, some of them have been used quite successfully in a lot of different pop rock songs. Led Zeppelin, in particular, used a lot of modes in their writing. And you hear a lot of that kind of stuff, especially in rock music. They like to use a lot of the darker modes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The interesting about Locrian, is it Locrian or Locrian? Especially because it's the only mode that has a flat 5, right? And that makes it especially attractive to really, really dark music, because everyone else likes, we all love the perfect fifth, and we're all very, very attuned to hearing the perfect fifth everywhere we go. And Locrian just throws that out the window, says, no, I'm going with a flat 5, which makes it really hard to work with.
So a flat 5 from that root, because there is, I think Lydian has a sharpened fourth, isn't it?
4.
Yeah.
But it's still got a perfect fifth.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Okay.
Right.
Well, let's talk about Dorian and everything that we need to know about Dorian.
Okay. So I have a little example here of a song that's in Dorian. And just so that I can sing this, I've changed the key slightly. This is Tears for Fears song called Mad World, which I think a lot of people know. It was famously redone a few years back, sort of as a piano ballad, but originally was written by Tears for Fears back in, I think it was 1982 or 83. So I'm just going to play a bit of this, and then we'll analyze it. We'll talk about, how this kind of works with Dorian. It's actually a combination of Aeolian, so natural minor, and Dorian. And if you can listen carefully, you'll hear that shift from Aeolian to Dorian. So it starts like this. All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for the daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, cause I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very bad world. Bad world. Bad world. Bad world. So,
Very nice.
did you guys hear where the shift happens? Where it changes?
Does it feels kind of funny? Is that where
Yes.
the shift is?
Yes, it's kind of the chorus. So the beginning of the song starts basically in D natural minor. So the chords are, if we're doing it in D minor here, D minor, F, C, and then G minor, which comes from basically D Aeolian, which is actually exactly the same as Dorian. It just has a flat 6. So that's the natural minor for D. There's also, of course, D harmonic minor and D melodic minor, which are variations on that. But the natural D minor has a B flat, or a flat 6. So you can hear that in the chords, right? I'm basically playing the 1 chord, the 3 chord, the 3 major, the 7 major, and then the 4 minor, right? So those are the chords that make up the verse. But then it has a little change in the chorus, and basically it just has 2 chords. It goes from D minor, or the 1 chord, to a major 4 chord, which is really interesting. And quite a lift to it if you compare that to the verse, which is a bit darker sounding with that minor 4 chord. So once I raise my 6th note, that gives me Dorian, right? And that's where that chord comes from, because if you raise the sixth note now, you have a B instead of a B flat, or basically a major six instead of a minor six, and that gives you slightly different chords. So if I was to analyze the chords in the different keys, if I do minor, or the natural minor, I basically end up with a minor chord, a diminished chord, major, minor, minor, major, major, and then minor again. That would be basically my chord scale for Aeolian or natural minor. As soon as I change it to Dorian, now I've got a collection of different chords. So I still got minor at the beginning, but I go up one and now I get another minor instead of a diminished chord, which is much more useful, and it sounds much nicer. Then I've got a major three chord, and then I've got that major four chord, which again is really nice. It gives a nice lift to the key there. And then I've got a minor chord, minor six chord, and then a minor five chord, diminished six chord, major seven chord again, and then back to minor.
So Jeff, can I ask something? So when people are working in major, and mostly early songwriters are used to working in major, the steps of the scale have kinds of chords associated with it. So usually your 1 and your 4 and your 5 are the major, which is, it's 1, 4, 5, those are major. Your minors are 2, 3, 6, and then 7, which is basically whatever you can get away with if you're a guitar player. It's usually diminished in major, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
But so the different modes have different kinds of chords associated with their own sort of scale steps. Because I think we're going to be working with Lydian, which has the 1 and the 2, which are major chords. But in Dorian, 1 and 2 are both minor.
Yes.
I believe. Because you'll notice that Santana uses Dorian a lot, because he does the ones, he does a 1-7, and then he'll do a 4-7. And a lot of jam bands like that, Dorian, because you can just kind of jam on it, and it's sort of kind of airy. So all the modes have different kinds of chords on each one of the scale steps, and that kind of helps you explore that mode a bit, because whether it's like minor, minor, and a major, or major, major, and a minor, versus the major scale, which we're all used to using, which is major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. So just to help listeners out there, please go ahead there, Jeff.
Yeah. So I guess
Can I actually just interject with one thing about how you were going through that process and about how Mad World works? The other way to really think about this very, very simply is to say that if you are in D minor, normally your 4 chord would be a G minor. And they do that in the verse, right? So they're strictly in minor, and then they open up to Dorian in the chorus. And basically, they're just flipping that 4 chord, the G minor, into a G major. So you're doing what they call a modal interchange. You're taking one of the minor chords and you're flipping it to major, or vice versa. You're taking one of the major chords and flipping it to minor. And I think that's kind of a simple way to get into modal sort of playing and writing, is just to say, these are the normal chords I'm working with. Let's take one of them and flip it major, minor, or minor, major, and see what that sounds like, and then you're starting to play around with modes.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Often, a lot of composers will mix and match from different modes. Of course, minor and major is the most common one, borrowing chords from minor, putting them in major, or vice versa. But also, putting Dorian chords in there, putting in Locrian chords and that sort of thing sometimes, right? It actually gives you a really, really wide palette of colors, right? If you start thinking outside of major and just thinking 1, 4, 5, and especially when you're working with minor, that one small change makes a huge difference. You can hear it in the song, in the melody as well, right? So the melody for the verse is. Right, but then it changes in the chorus to use that raised 6, right? So with the Dorian, we've got that raised 6, and now the melody becomes. So it's playing off of both the chords and the melody with that raised 6, which really makes a nice change in the chorus in that song.
I wanted to point out a possible area of confusion because you referred to Dorian chords. The only things that makes them Dorian is their relationship to each other, because they're still the same chords, but it's just whether or not you're using a major, major, minor, or a minor, minor, major. Those two sort of relations between them will kind of give it a modal, like maybe a Dorian or whatever other mode you're working with, sound, but you're still using the same chords as the major scale, but you're just putting them in different order.
Yeah, and it's really important. What really makes it Dorian or whatever mode that you want to be in is that root, right? So you can hear in this song that D minor chord is always the root, right? It goes back to the D minor, right? The verse starts in D minor. Naturally go back to D minor, right? And the same thing in that chorus, right? It's centered around D minor again because it keeps going back to that D again, right? So that's really the difference in what makes something sound Dorian or Lydian or Mixolydian as opposed to the major. Because you're right, it's actually C major. I'm playing in C major right now, just up a step. Right. So you have to be careful. And this is something I was going to talk a little bit about with Lydian as well. You have to be careful in your use of the chords, right? Because if you don't use the chords in the right way, it will sound like you're in that major key as opposed to being in the mode that you're trying to use.
Especially with Lydian, because Lydian.
What do you mean by that, playing, like composing it correctly?
What I mean is correct in the way that you want to write in that mode. So I don't necessarily mean, correct or incorrect. You can write anything you want, of course, right? And you don't even have to say that this is in this mode. But if you're trying to write a piece in Dorian, you have to be careful just what that root is, right? If I use that C chord too often, right, in D Dorian, it's going to sound possibly like I'm in C major rather than D Dorian, right? So if my intent is to write in D Dorian, I need to make sure that it's centered around that D as the root of the song.
Yeah, with the example we have for Lydian, which is Dreams by Fleetwood Mac, the question that arises for me, especially comparing the two songs, the Tears for Fears song starts in minor, the verse is clearly in minor, and then the chorus is clearly in Dorian, whereas Dreams is Lydian all the way through. Is there a thing, Jeff, where a lot of songs are strictly one mode, like you say correctly, like playing within the scope of one mode, or do many songs sort of interchange, like different sections of songs can take on a different mode?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to write an entire song, for instance, in D Dorian, and that song is good proof of that. It sounds really nice with that change from the natural minor to Dorian. It gives it that nice lift in the chorus. So often, when you listen to a lot of songs, there will be changes within the song, even different keys, right? It might go from D minor to F major, for example. And the same with modes. You could have a chorus that's in Lydian, right? And then the verse maybe is just in regular major or something like that. So it actually, like I said, it just opens up this wide palette of colors that you can use and in any way that you want. You can have different sections in different modes. You can have different sections in different keys.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll be posting that video that we shared a while back. David Bennett, one of our YouTube viewers, that again, this video that I saw was really the eye opener for me, because he did start talking about it in terms of light and dark, which is really a great way to me for exploring those kinds of changes. Do you want your chorus to be brighter? Do you want your chorus to be darker? Do you want your bridge to be lighter or darker? Then that can inform which mode you're going to go into.
A great tip for working with modes is, if you want to have different sections, is use the major scale that the mode is derived from and sort of switching for that into the chorus. So if you're doing, let's say, a Dorian, which is, the Dorian vamp, they call it, which is the... And this would be A Dorian. Of course, that uses all the notes from the G major scale, is that you can actually just go into G, and that it's a very comfortable kind of change, even though you're using the same note. So. And then, because you're using the same notes, they're kind of related. And that kind of gives it a nice lift. And there's an example in Lydian when we get to it that I can that I'll mention as well, because it works quite well.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So why don't we move on to our Lydian example? Jeff, you want to talk about dreams a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I guess. Yeah, why don't we talk about the Lydian scale first?
Yes, okay. Fair enough.
So if we're going back to C major, let's just talk about it in relation to C, because I'm a keyboard player. Sorry, Phil. So starting in C, right, we've got our regular major scale, right, going up and down. So to make it Lydian, I'm raising the fourth note of my major scale. And that's basically the only change. So I get to the fourth note, and it goes up a half step, and the rest of it is just major, right? It is also the fourth degree of the major scale. So if I play a C major scale, and I just move up 4 notes, and I play a C major scale again, starting on the fourth note, that gives me F Lydian, right? Which is another way to look at it, right? So you can look at it either way. I like to think of it just as a sharp 4, because you can just quickly figure out, okay, what key am I in? Oh, I'm in A. Okay, A major scale, raise that fourth note, done. So it makes it a quick way to sort of figure out the key if you have to do that. So in Lydian, you've got that raised fourth, which has a very, very distinctive sound. It really makes it a little brighter, especially when it comes to the second chord. Now I'm actually playing this in A, so I'll just give an example in A. So here's A major, and here's A Lydian. And that really changes the harmony as well as the melody of the song. So I'll play a little bit of Dreams. Now, this is kind of in Lydian, but there's a bit of controversy about that, which I think we'll talk about afterwards. I still see it as Lydian, but other people don't, because it's centered around A, right? In this case, the original song, I think, is in F. I changed it just so I can sing it. So it's centered around that A as the tonic, and that's, to me, is what kind of makes it Lydian. So I'm just going to do a little bit of the chorus, which I'm sure everybody's heard before. Thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. So women, they will come and they will go. When the rain washes you clean, you'll know. You'll know. So you can hear it, basically the whole song is 2 chords.
Yeah.
And it is in the verse as well. It just basically, it's 2 chords all the way through. So in the key of A, the chords I'm playing are A major and B major, although I'm kind of doing a B sus4 just to make it sound nice on piano. But basically the song is A major, B major, or if you look at it in harmonic terms in Lydian, it's the 1 chord and the 2 chord.
Which are both major.
Yeah, which is really interesting because that normally doesn't happen, right? So it kind of gives it a very, very unique sound. If I was to do a chord scale going up in Lydian, what I get is I get major, major, minor, and then I have a diminished chord, which is a little odd, on the
Four chord.
four chord, and then the 5 chord is major, and then we've got minor. And then we got, what's interesting is we have a minor chord as well on the 7, which is usually diminished, which is kind of interesting. And that also gives it kind of an interesting sound, right? So we've got a minor 7, and then we've also got a major 2, which are kind of the 2 big changes in Lydian. And then the melody kind of plays off of the major 7 of that chord, right? So if I'm on A and I go up to the 7th note in the scale, I get a G sharp. So the melody actually starts on the 7, right? In the chorus. But the whole song is kind of sort of centered around the sort of like the 3rd minor of your Lydian scale. And therein lies a bit of the controversy, because some people think that it actually belongs to that minor scale as opposed to a Lydian. So there's kind of 2 ways of looking at it. Since it never goes to that chord, I think it's in Lydian because it really is centered around that A chord, or the 1 chord in Lydian. But others, I believe, have correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but have thought of it in terms of that minor key. So basically, it's
when I did look it up on ultimateguitar.com, it like you say, originally it's in F. They didn't say the first chord was F major. They said the first chord was A minor. And when I played it like that on my piano, it would sound like I'm playing along to the song. It would sound completely wrong. The one difference is I found that at the top of the chorus, it felt more like an F major 7, which has an A minor on top of it. Like it incorporates the A minor. So I think, there is a little bit of fuzziness there, I suppose. But I would tend to agree with you, Jeff. It is certainly major 1, major 2. Like.
I think one of the issues is very often with Lydian, because Lydians, they call it a very unstable mode, that if you break up with it, it'll sort of like scratch your car up and stuff. So, you want to be careful with Lydian. That they very often, because it's so easy to, especially if you hit the 5, because the 5 is so strong, because it's a major, that they will very often pedal on the root. And just giving you an example is, I think it's from Tom Petty's "Here Comes My Girl," and it's again a major 1, major 2 chord. Which a lot of guitarists do. As we do this, guitarists learn the shape and they just move their hand up and down. That's why guitarists do what they do. So it's 1 and 2. So you could play 1 and 2, which in this case would be A and B, which is. So that's 1 and 2. But what he does is he pedals on the A. So he gets. And that kind of gives it more of a Lydian sound. And just to give you an indication, because I think Lydian is related to the E major scale, I believe. So if you do that, that kind of sounds cool. Then go up to the E. It kind of gives it that nice natural sort of lift. And it doesn't sound like it's a key change, but because it's a mode change, but it's the related major to that mode. And kind of playing around with those 2 things can be kind of a nice, easy way of getting a nice natural lift. Yeah. So it's that a lot of people feel that usually John Williams he uses Lydian a lot, but he often will pedal his root note, which kind of helps it maybe seem a bit more Lydian.
Yeah. I think one thing you just have to be careful of in Lydian is that 2 chord. And the reason why is if you think about it, where Lydian sits in the major scale, it's the 4th degree of your major scale. That 2nd chord is actually also the dominant of your major scale.
Right.
So when you're writing in Lydian, it's very, very important that you strongly emphasize that root because, as you said, it is unstable. And if you use too much of that two chord, right, which is also the dominant chord in major, it's going to sound like it's in major, right? And there's actually a lot of pieces. I was kind of looking up, different Lydian songs for the show. There's a lot of songs that are erroneously called Lydian that really are just on the four chord of the major. Right, they're kind of centered on the four chord, and then they end up in major later, which really kind of makes them major, not Lydian. Right, so it really has to center on that first chord of Lydian as the root to be sort of true Lydian. You can kind of do it for a while and then go to the major, but then it really sort of becomes the major key as opposed to the Lydian key.
Right.
Or Lydian.
And it's interesting what you guys are both saying something that again, the YouTube that I explored F Mixolydian on. The other discovery I made was, I've always known about leading tones, but it really became illuminated in the idea of leading tones. You talk about what the dominant chord is of a key, and that you can use it as a strong cadence back to your one chord, and that really solidifies that it's in this key or this mode. And
what is a leading tone?
So a leading tone is when you're moving from, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but the way I understand it is you're moving from one chord to another chord, and in that relationship, there's a semitone movement of one of those notes. The chord is typically a triad, 3 notes, and one of those notes, particularly the third, sometimes is moving, a semitone into the back to the one chord. And like Jeff, I feel you were just talking about, moving from A Lydian into E, because A Lydian has that sharp 4, and it's a semitone away from E, right? And that's why that movement sort of sounds smooth and consonant, more so than if you move to something that's more further detached.
That's true.
Do you think that's a good assessment, Jeff? Or
Yeah. Basically, it is often a semitone relationship, and then you've also got like dominant 7 chords, right, where you have the tritone, right? Devil's interval, as they used to refer to it back in the olden days, and you'd be punished with death if you used it. That tritone, if you're doing a dominant 7 chord, also referred to as a diminished 5th or an augmented 4th, really wants to resolve, right? That leads very strongly to basically back to your major 1 chord. Now, this becomes a bit complicated, for instance, in Lydian, where that dominant chord is actually your second chord in Lydian, right? And this is where the problem arises in making sure that you're in Lydian and not in major, because that chord really wants to resolve back to the 1 chord of your key, right? So if I'm doing this in G major, but let me go to A again, because we're kind of talking about A. So if I do an E7, or E dominant 7 chord, that naturally wants to go to A, right? Or to the root chord of A major. And that is actually, I'm doing that in...
That would be in major, right?
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking A, I should be thinking E. So we're actually talking about E major, but A Lydian. Sorry, my signals got crossed there. So actually it would be a B7, really wants to go back to an E chord, right? So E, of course, is not the tonic chord of A Lydian, right? And that's the problem, right? So if we use that incorrectly, it's going to really sound like it's in E, right? That it wants to go back to E. And that major chord, even though it doesn't have that tritone in it, it's still got that really strong sort of dominant feel. And in a way, also the first chord of Lydian has a strong pull as well, because that's actually the subdominant. So when we talk about 1, 4, 5 chords, 1 is your tonic, 4 is your subdominant, and 5 is your dominant chord, right? So in the key of E, 1 is E, 4 would be A, and 5 would be B. So when I'm doing Lydian, my first chord is actually that subdominant chord, right? So when I do this, which is my 1 chord and 2 chord in Lydian, it really kind of feels like I want to go back here, because that's what our ear is used to hearing.
Right. Yeah, of course.
I wanted to give an example of leading tones, because I think if you're not really clear about what that means, I'm just going to go from A to D, and so that note is a leading note. That's the leading tone you're talking about. It's a half step away. And that's what makes it sound smooth. And I think that's what Neil was.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people play around with not not with minor natural, but minor melodic or minor harmonic, because it has that raised seventh, which gives it, a semitone away from your root note. I learned all this stuff. I actually kind of knew it intuitively, but it was a Rick Beato video where he started talking about this kind of in depth and really started illuminating it in certain songs with the way the melody worked and with the chords worked and everything. I'm like, oh yeah, leading tones are actually way more important than I thought they were.
So Jeff, how about when working with modes, what should our listeners think about?
Yeah, I think the thing is that when you're writing a song, ultimately you want to pick what works with the song, and if you're writing a song in major, for example, try to look at some of the other modes perhaps that aren't too far away from that major key, right? So Lydian is actually a good one in that case because there's only one note different, right? We're just raising that 2 chord, right? So major to Lydian is a really nice kind of change in there, and it gives you some different chords that you can use. Even if your song is just in major, you can, borrow that 2 major chord, for instance, right? To make it sound a little bit more interesting. You can also borrow the 7 minor chord is a nice one as well, right? Using this as opposed to the diminished chord, which doesn't sound very nice in major, right? So, borrowing those chords can really help sort of give your song different colors. And of course, the melody would sort of go along with that, right? So if your melody kind of fits with those chords, you just have to make sure that you make the changes in the melody that match your harmonic changes. But yeah, if you kind of go to a mode that's very similar, it sounds great, and it's not too far of a change. If you went from major to Locrian, for example, that maybe might not sound quite so good because so many notes are being changed from where you're coming from. Another good one to consider is Mixolydian, right? Because that, again, is only one note different. Mixolydian is a lowered 7, basically, from your major scale. And again, that gives you some other interesting chords like your dominant 7, which is used, dominant 7-1 chord, which is used quite a bit in the blues. So if you listen to blues music, often they'll have dominant chords on the tonic. And that, again, gives it a really interesting sound. Also gives you a flat 7 major chord, which is a really nice change. So again, going down from your tonic chord, rather than doing this, which is what it would be in major, you can do this, which is a really nice change, going down basically a whole step from your root chord. So all of these give your song different colors, both harmonically and melodically.
But when you build a chord, aren't you usually using a flat and 7th? So if I make a 9th, isn't the 7th usually flattened?
There's a major 7 as well.
There's a major 7. Then it would be major 7, 9.
Yeah, so the major 7 is the natural 7 from the major scale. So the dominant 7 is more commonly used than the major 7. Major 7 is used a bit more in jazz. Yeah. So yeah, when you see a 7 on a chord, that is traditionally a dominant 7. So it's a lowered 7 from your major scale.
But that doesn't make it Mixolydian just because you're using a dominant chord.
Right. Yeah.
Not necessarily, because you're talking about where the key is actually anchored, and this is it's more stuff than that than just using it. Because you're right, dominant chords are all over the place in blues, in rock, in pop, and everything.
Yeah, and they're traditionally sort of used more on the 5 chord, right? The 5 chord is quite often dominant because that helps pull you back to the root of the key, right? So if I do 1, 4, and then 5, 7, that really pulls back strongly back to that root chord. But in blues, for instance, they make all of those dominant, right? So it'd be a dominant 1 chord, dominant 4 chord, dominant 5 chord, right? Which really changes the sound. And that's more similar to Mixolydian.
Right. Right. Yeah. Because if you're just using a dominant 5 chord, you're still in, like, if you're in a major key and using a dominant 5 chord, you're not going out of key. You're not.
Yeah, so that's still natural.
It's still natural. Excellent.
So Neil, you had talked about sort of brightness and darkness in the various modes. Can you expand on that a bit?
We're going to post a resource on the website as well that our listeners should be familiar with the circle of fifths, because we posted it as a number of times, and it's kind of related to the circle of fifths in terms of, like Mixolydian, like we were saying before, it's the same as a major scale but one flat, and Dorian has the same as a major scale but two flats, Aeolian 3 flats, Phrygian 4 flats, Locrian 5 flats. It's kind of crazy, right? And Lydian 1 sharp. So when you think about sharp and dark, or bright and dark, the same way as we talked about in our circle of fifths episode, if you're going from one section of a song to another section of a song and you're going clockwise in your modulation, then it's going to sound brighter. It's going to tend to sound brighter, and vice versa. If you go counterclockwise, it's going to sound a little bit darker. And the resource we're posting on the website, which takes circle of fifths, and I just added sort of the modes as they relate to the C root key, is the same sort of thinking. So if you're in Ionian and you want to sound darker, then you might go to Dorian. If you're in Aeolian and you want to sound brighter, you might want to go to Mixolydian and go clockwise on the circle. So it's just a little guide to sort of say, this way is brighter and this way is darker, generally speaking. I mean, your melody is going to factor into that, and your lyrics and all the rest of it will factor into that sort of thing. But just in terms of a tonal palette, it may sound a little bit darker or brighter. That's all.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
The other question I had, Jeff, is that, I mean, the three of us actually collaborated on picking these songs. One from 1983 and one from 1970, whenever Dreams came out, way back when. Are there current pop music, are they playing with modes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, unfortunately, a lot of mainstream pop music has, gone very, very simple. A lot of songs use the same chords, for instance, in the verse and the chorus. Often there's no bridges anymore, right? So the whole song tends to be 3-4 chords often, and it tends to be centered around either major or minor, just those standard keys. However, there's a lot of sort of underground music out there which experiments with that still. There's a lot of sort of jazz and funk groups out there. I'm a big fan of like Lewis Cole and Knower. I don't know if you guys know them, but they're like a young group of sort of funk jazz musicians from the US. And they still, I mean, their music is more jazzy, so they're going to explore that stuff more. They use some of that. And there's, I think there's some other groups that are, sort of lean in that same direction. There's a bit more complicated music out there, and I think it is still being used. One place it's still being used a lot is film scores, right? So film scores use a lot of different modes and also variations of modes. And actually, one of them I'll just mention really quickly because I was going to talk about this. We were talking about Lydian before. About that raised 4. There's also something called Lydian flat 7, which Danny Elfman loves. So if you take that scale and you just lower that 7 as well, you kind of get a combination of Lydian and Mixolydian, and then you get The Simpsons.
The Simpsons theme, yeah.
So he's basing that all around Lydian flat 7. So there's combinations of modes that you can use too. But yeah, it's very common in film score music. You hear that Lydian especially all the time for those fantasy sequences or dream sequences. Right, because it has such a nice sort of uplifting fantasy quality to it. There's also something called the whole tone scale, which is similar to Lydian, and that's also used quite a bit. So it's used a lot in film score. It's used with groups that are sort of doing a little bit of more jazzy type music. But I would say in mainstream pop music, there isn't a lot of modal stuff, unfortunately, going on.
Interesting. Yeah, because I mean, there's these two songs we picked. They were pop songs back in their day.
Yeah. Maybe we'll kick off a new modal revolution in pop music.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
And just for the record, Neil, you were saying about which keys have 2 flats or 3 sharps. Guitarists never think that way. So
yeah, it is a very piano centric. Yeah. Interesting.
We're from different worlds, but somehow we make it work.
we make it work somehow. It's yeah, and that's all I can do. I can think like a pianist because I am a pianist.
That's true.
I've tried to think like a guitarist. It boggles my mind. I don't get it.
All those guitarists and all their sharp keys.
Yeah. They never. When I was in high school, all the band music was in like 3/4 flats. You'd talk to a guitarist and playing 4 flats and be like, what?
Well, because what guitarists do is we know that, you start off and you put your hand shape on the 3rd fret, and then you move it up to the 5th fret. And then if the guitarist says he wants it higher, you start on the 4th fret and then you go to the 6th fret. Like they don't sort of think about music in that same kind of way.
No,
they think about like hand shapes and moving their hands around. And that's so guitar music has a certain quality to it because we tend to, and we do a lot of that 1 major, 2 major thing because that's really common, especially when you're just starting out. You just only know how to use the major hand shape and just moving it up and down the neck.
And if you want modal stuff in guitar, you got to go to like jazz or progressive rock or bands like the old school Genesis or some of the 90s stuff. Psychedelic Furs, there are a lot of guitarists out there that do play with modes for sure.
Yeah. So Jeff, did you ever have an aha moment in working with modes that our listeners might be able to glean from you?
An aha moment. I think I studied them when I went to Humber College for jazz, just theoretically, and didn't really think too much about it. It's just, okay, so this is Ionian, this is Dorian, this is Lydian. It was all kind of like theoretical concepts. But I think when I started, especially writing music for film, I think that was probably the first time, apart from soloing, like in jazz soloing, you do use those modes quite often, right? So I was playing, for instance, Lydian or Lydian flat 7 over a dominant chord in jazz music, because that's very common. But I think from a writing perspective, I think that for me it was when I did film music, because there's so much use of those different modes, which creates so much color and also emotion. Right, using like I mentioned, Lydian sort of creates like a fantasy, a lifting sort of element. Really makes you feel wonder. Whereas using Phrygian or using Aeolian will make it much darker sounding. And it's really interesting in your use of harmony, because you listen to film scores, especially, the chords are all over the place. John Williams, Danny Elfman, all those guys, they don't stay in one key. And, 4 bars might be Lydian, and then all of a sudden it's off somewhere else and it's gone to a completely different key. So that was sort of an aha moment for me. Like I found that I could use these modes to create, feeling and create emotion.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that's a real takeaway for our listeners too, is start to explore this stuff and try and think about the ways that you can write with modes with intention. Right, like say, like we're saying, if you want a darker, if you want a lighter, brighter tone, then move this way, move that way, and let it support it. Because, like you say, a lot of, we talk about things like prosody, like lining up the lyric with the music. If your bridge lyrically goes to someplace really dark, do you then want to move into a darker mode and see how that feels like, or do you just want to stay in major like you've always done? But think about how the tone of the music reflects your lyrical content is one way to think about it as a songwriter.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Absolutely, and lots to explore. So hopefully everyone joins in on our songwriting challenge this year. I know we're going to enjoy it, right, Phil?
I think so, actually.
and Jeff, you're more than welcome to participate in our challenge. Write a song in a particular mode, not a film score.
It's true.
A song, which could be an interesting challenge for you. All right, thanks so much for being here with us today, Jeff Greenway. And where can the listeners hear more of your music?
I have a webpage, jeffalangreenway.com, and I'm also active on SoundCloud and on Facebook if anybody's interested in checking it out.
Cool. We'll certainly send our listeners that way. So be sure to check out the show post for this episode. Lots of resources. And we're also going to have a dedicated webpage on our website, songtalk.ca, about all about the 2023 Songwriting Challenge, which we're going to put lots of resources about modes and all the episodes that we do associated with it. So be sure to check that out. And we do want to hear from you. So please send us your comments, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Songtalk Radio, or send us an email, feedback@songtalk.ca. Also be sure to check out our YouTube channel for live performance videos and full episodes. Subscribe today to the Songtalk Radio podcast on your favorite podcast provider, and you can find links to all the stuff we mentioned, especially on this episode, on our resources page on songtalk.ca. And please join us at our next monthly Song Talk meetup. Whether you're in Toronto for our in-person meetups or anywhere in the world for our online meetups, it's free to join on meetup.com and free to attend the meetup, bring a song and a lyric sheet, and get constructive feedback from other songwriters. Stop by songtalk.ca for the link. You can follow me at neilmodi.com. You can follow Phil
at philemery.ca.
And Jeff, what's your favorite social media platform? Where do you go the most?
Probably Facebook.
Facebook. All right. Check out Jeff Alan Greenway on Facebook. And thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to stop by the website, songtalk.ca, to browse past shows and find out how you can be a guest. Thanks for tuning in, and keep on writing.
Hey, we did it that time.
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah.